Welcome in to another episode of Discard for Magic. I'm one of your hosts, Aaron.
And I'm your other host, James or Jexic, and today we're joined by Morningtime to discuss the Phoenix Elves.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on.
So, Morningtime, why don't you just start off by giving us a little backstory into how you found Summoner Wars?
I was a very early player of Summoner Wars First Edition. Buddy of mine was into the Heroescape side of things, found out about it from there, and so he got the game on release. So that came out, November, December 2009, and I was playing by January of 2010.
Nice. Yeah, so you're one of the original players. Did you guys do the team games?
Oh, yeah. We played a lot of 2v2 early on. And even so, the Phoenix Elves were one of those first 4 factions that came out with the game, and there were 4 of us that played in 4 of those factions, and so that kind of ended up being my go-to deck from day one.
Prince Elion main, eh?
Yep.
Back with the OG Fire Drake.
So what do you think appealed to you about that faction at the start?
So I played a lot of chess as a kid. I didn't really get into the, kind of hobby board game side of things until college. And one thing I like about the Phoenix Elves is there's a lot of definite damage. You know what you're doing on your turn. I mean, sure, the dice rolling is part of it, but there's that very kind of calculated movement with your limited tools. And I really like that calculated, you know which units you're definitely going to take out each turn, and you're minimizing the role that chance plays each time.
That was probably a little more pronounced in first edition, but there's still some elements of that here in second.
Oh, I definitely think that's still one of their core attributes in second, at least the way I played them. Now, I guess one thing, since I play a lot of Phoenix Elves, I don't really get as much of an opportunity to see maybe how a lot of other good players play them as often. So there might be some difference in strategy out there that I'm not seeing.
If someone was just starting out with the Phoenix Elves, what would be like some tips you would give them?
I know one general thing about Summoner Wars, especially in second edition, is that being able to attack with your unit and then get them out of danger is one of the most powerful things in the game. And with Maldaria's ability, you can use that game mechanic every single turn. And a good thing starting out would be try to, use her ability to make attacks with her and another unit and then pull everyone back together so that you're protected.
How do you think that has changed since like the deck changed? Do you like the changes that were made, or do you think that changed the way you play too much?
Overall, I think it's helped certain matchups especially. It's mitigated some of the deck's weaknesses a little bit just because she is such a fragile summoner compared to some of the other ones. Only 9 hit points. You can't really take a lot of chip damage. One thing that is, I guess, a little different is being able to kind of build up those boosts. Before, you could use her ability, spend boosts to move units adjacent to her, and even if you didn't attack, as long as you had that boost from previous turn. So that's one thing that's a little different. I can't say in the original edition that I necessarily did that as often. It felt a little disappointing to not be able to do it, but in general, I'm very happy with the changes and new way the ability works.
Which of the 3 aspects do you think is the biggest change? Do you think the ability to attack structures and have her ability activate, or the fact that she can now pull champs, or the fact that the units next to her can't be forced? Which of those 3 do you think is the most important?
Not having them being forced, I think, is definitely a key.
It definitely changed the Tundra Orc matchup, which is the one that people get in the box now,
the Tundra Orcs, the Mountain Vargath.
Mm-hmm.
The Mountain Vargath are still a really tough matchup for them. Before that change, that was definitely a little bit more of a problem for the Phoenix Elves.
And Breakers are probably another one, too.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, Breakers are another one. And it's not being forced or attacked through also, so it really helps with the Skyspear Avians also. And
sure.
Skyspear Avians before those changes, I feel was super lopsided.
Right, and it's interesting. I don't know if it's just a holdover from the original way the faction worked. Whenever I'm against the Avians with the Phoenix Elves, I get very nervous about it. And so I was a little surprised. I was looking back over some of my stats, in anticipation of this, and at least over the last 1,000 games, I haven't lost a match to the Avians. So maybe I'm just still really nervous about them from the earlier way her ability worked.
Yeah. What's your record against them? Do you remember?
I think I'm like 12-0.
Wow. Pretty impressive.
I definitely heard the matchup had changed. That's good. So when it comes to the units, I guess we could start with the commons. Like, how often do you play all the different commons?
I definitely think the Ember Beast is the heart of everything I do with this faction. I think that is one of the most efficient 2-cost commons in the game.
That's interesting because I mean their stats make them look like they're not as strong, but you're just saying their ability is very good.
Oh yeah, the ability to just add damage, especially add damage to multiple adjacent units, and that you can summon it off of those other Ember units. So I think not even necessarily playing them, but even just the threat of being able to pop down a mage or an archer and then a beast one space further, you can surround champions and take them out. You can get them in a position to damage multiple units at a time. I definitely think Ember Beasts are the most valuable common in the deck. Looking at some of the other ones, Ember Mages and Archers, they're both very good too. I think it's very situational which one is more powerful in any given matchup or in any given game state. Ember Mages end up being one of the almost tankier units in the deck, which is weird for a 2-life unit. Just the fact that it's going to take 2 attacks to hit them, or an attack and some other damage source. You're really kind of taking the wind out of a lot of an opponent's attack to be able to get rid of one of them on their turn.
Yeah, for factions that don't have ping, 2 smashers have to hit this before it's gone or whatever.
Sure. And I guess the Guardian, they're really more of a support role. In general, they're probably the one that I play the least often, but they can be very good at setting up big turns. Or if you have the opportunity to use a Spirit of the Phoenix, even just that difference between definitely getting 1 damage shoving something and then probably getting another from the melee versus getting 2 damage guaranteed and then probably getting the melee, that can really turn the tide in favor of summoning a Guardian that turn.
I mean, Guardians are also kind of neat, I think, because they can help push things into Maldaria's shot. Like if they're not, otherwise wouldn't be able to get an attack off with her, you can kind of use them to do stuff safely, right?
Oh yeah, certainly. Yeah. They're very good at setting up big plays, even if they're not necessarily doing the most dramatic things themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because a lot of people look at their stats and just think that they're understated, but I think they're probably still a decent common.
Yeah, well, there are a number of 1-cost 4/1 units. So that second magic cost, I mean, I guess in some ways, they've got 1 attack, but you're probably getting a second damage depending on the game position.
So that's the commons. So where do you rank their champs? Who do you think is the most valuable champion?
The Fire Drake is such a great unit. It's expensive. And I think the, managing your magic economy is a really big part of playing the Phoenix Elves well. Not only in terms of needing to summon units, but having the threat of what you could do on your turn. So I love the Fire Drake. Having those 8 magic to spend is rough. And if you're in a position where you have those 8 magic, a lot of the time you're already doing pretty well in the game. You don't necessarily need it unless it's to finish off in an end game. Finesse is probably the champ that I summon the most often. Being able to do extra damage other than your attacks, I think, is one of the best things about the Phoenix Elves. And so getting that riposte in is just a real great way to get chip damage. And even if you're not necessarily going to be getting kills with that, it sets up your other units to get easy kills when it's your turn again.
Do you find that Finessa is like very matchup dependent, or do you summon her in most matchups? Because like a more ranged matchup, for example, against the Breakers, the ability might not be as effective. The stat line's still not bad, but
right. Well, yeah. So if it is a very range heavy faction, the Breakers, for instance, the Breakers is one of the few matchups I'll summon Heleus most of the time. I'd say more often than not, if I have Heleus in my hand, I'm going to drop her for magic without really thinking about it. But yeah, if it is a very range-heavy faction, I'll summon Helaeus. The other thing that she's really good for is not even so much as an attacker or even for her buff, but just as that mobile spawn point. Because the Phoenix Elves tend to play a little defensively, they've got such a fragile summoner. One of their weaknesses, I think, overall is factions that clog up your walls or try to tear gates. Sorry, it's my first edition coming through. I'll probably call them walls again at some point. So. But factions that clog up your gates or try to tear them down can be a real challenge if you don't get your second gate early. And so just having Helaeus as a mobile spawn point, I think I use her for that more often than anything else if I'm going to bring her out.
Phoenix Elves definitely have that strength of being able to summon in more spots besides their gates. So like sometimes even when you destroy their gates, they're still just kind of able to keep trucking.
Or you just save up for that fire drake.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Like, but if you just have I've had games where I've destroyed their gates and they've got like an Ember Mage out and something. There's all these beasts and stuff, So it's like...
Well, and even, if your gates are destroyed, that's, the Fire Drake is expensive, but that's the time, okay, drop 4 magic from your hand, summon that Drake the next turn, and maybe try to hold out for another hand or two until you can get another gate on the field.
Yeah, I think their champs are even such a bigger piece of their game plan now that they can be pulled back to Maldaria. Vanessa and Helaeus were pretty good beforehand, but I think that makes the Fire Drake so much better even now.
Oh, certainly.
Bringing the Fire Drake back after launching it into your enemy territory to take a shot at a summoner through other units or something always feels good.
What are your priorities with their events and how to use them, or how long will you hold on to them? Which ones do you discard? That kind of stuff.
I think Spirit of the Phoenix, very rarely have I ever discarded Spirit of the Phoenix. Even if you get 1 extra kill or 2 extra chip damage, I think it's worth playing.
Yeah, because it's again that guaranteed damage that you can count on.
Well, and I'm always trying to think about how I can make my turns more economically efficient than my opponents. Because you have that ability to pull units back to your summoner. One thing I'm always thinking about, okay, how can I get more kills, attack more units than they'll be able to on their turn? And so I think Spirit of the Phoenix is a way to clear a lot of material off the map, but also a way to do that without leaving units exposed to your enemy's attack. On the other hand, Blinding Flare, that's one that I normally drop.
Just because the extra magic costs, and a lot of times, it's good if you're getting attacked, but you really don't want Maldaria getting attacked anyway, right? So,
Right, usually if you need Blinding Flare, you're in a bad spot, and you don't necessarily have that extra magic you want to spend anyway.
What about the one that does damage back? Why am I forgetting? Oh, it's Retribution?
Retribution?
Divine Ret, yeah.
I've seen some other folks that don't like Divine Retribution, that, say drop it more often. I always like to hold on to it, especially if I can pair it on a turn with Spirit of the Phoenix.
Yeah, because it gets that extra damage too.
Right, and even if it's such a good deterrent, even if your opponent doesn't actually attack you to get all that retribution damage, it's a great way to keep another unit, let's say, on the field, just so your opponent avoids taking that reflect damage.
Yeah, and then in talking about Divine Retribution, it makes me think of another topic that we're going to get into, which is that how often do you kind of cross the midfield into your opponent's territory? Do you think you hang back more, or are you more of an aggressive Phoenix Elves player? Because one thing I find with Divine Retribution, sometimes when you play it, they'll just decide to destroy your gate instead. But
Sure.
if you have units in front of your gates and they have no option but to attack into Divine Retribution, then it makes it a stronger play. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so by definition, I think the Phoenix Elves, they have to play very defensively. Just, a little bit of chip damage and you're down. But yeah, that's a good opportunity to maybe leave a couple units further up than normal. In terms of thinking about playing offensively versus defensively, I like to think about my gate placement. So, B2 is my go-to gate placement with the Phoenix Elves.
Okay, so second column, second row.
Yeah, second column, second row. I like having that kind of L shape between your gates, just because I love to play the Ember Beast so much, and so having that ability, if a unit comes up adjacent or on the side of your starting gate, then you can already summon units adjacent to it and get the Ember Beast to damage it back. If I'm playing another very defensive faction, or if I'm playing, even let's say the Breakers, just because they're going to sit back and use ranged attacks, I will take Moldaria up to the halfway point and put another gate on the second column, fourth row instead some games.
Is this a faction you want to get all your gates out, or do you find yourself ever discarding some just for magic?
I really like to have 3 gates out. If I've got 3 gates and I don't feel especially at risk of losing them in the near future, I'll drop my last gate if I get it. But I think one of the biggest problems I run into as a Phoenix Elf player are units that can, tear down gates or clog up my spawn points if I don't draw my second gate quickly. I would say, great tip if you're playing against the Phoenix Elves with, maybe the Mountain Vargath or the Cave Goblins. Just go for the gates, because even with all those extra ways to summon units, you're just very vulnerable if you don't have a fair amount of protection. And the units are, they're kind of glass cannons in some ways, with the exception of maybe, the Ember Mage or the Guardian. But the ones I'm using most of the time, they don't have a ton of life. They don't have a lot of staying power. And so you really need those gates just to be extra bulk to keep Moldaria safe and give her a safe spot to hang out.
Yeah, that makes sense. I know there's some Phoenix Elves players who play Moldaria like super aggressively. Is that something you've ever done?
It's something I have done. It's something I'm always very nervous about doing. Against the Deepwood Groaks, yeah, I have to play offensively against them. I'll take Moldaria down onto the opponent's side of the field, and that you definitely do want to have more gates. I'll definitely want to play all my gates if I'm trying to be very aggressive and do that.
I was just going to say, I'm not sure which is the most effective approach. Phoenix Elves are not one of my strongest factions, but I've seen a couple of fairly strong players in the past against certain factions be very aggressive with Phoenix Elves, and sometimes it's hard to counter because of the fact that similar to if a Crimson Order player is very aggressive, because Maldaria can bring a unit back to that space, she can take a gate spot and then take it away with the unit she brings back. And there's sneaky ways that Phoenix Elves can really take the ground from somebody if they're up close and personal. But they do really, really well when people come to them. So I'm not sure what is the most effective way to play them.
Yeah, and I think, in some ways it's a little unfortunate that I don't necessarily see a lot of what some of the other really great Phoenix Elf players do. Talk about, being very aggressive and that hard to counter. I can't remember which players were playing, but the next table over from me at the Gen Con tournament this last year, I get done with my game and I look over and Moldaria is in the opponent's back row facing the Polar Dwarves and just, pulling units from her gates back to her every turn. And it was a fascinating game. I had to do a double take to try to figure out who was playing on which side.
So overall, where do you think that they rank these days after their changes and everything? Out of I guess we maybe don't know the 2 latest factions where they land, but the overall the 24, 26 faction meta, where do you think they land?
I think a lot of people underestimate the Phoenix Elves. I'd say they're a solidly middle of the pack faction. I think the last time I went and looked on Summoner Wars Zone, looking at the overall, rankings and tier lists, they were the second worst ranked faction. And I don't think they deserve that reputation. I think certainly they've got a couple bad matchups, but in general, they've got a lot of strengths and they're pretty versatile.
When Joe released his stats on the most popular decks, they were the 3rd most popular deck behind Crimson Order and Deepwood Groaks at that time. There's definitely other people who like them.
Well, I think there's something, very intuitive to them. You can set up some really interesting combos, but they're all combos that You can see what's going on with the units that are already, in your hand, and you can place them down one at a time and figure it out. I know, there's some other factions. If you look at some of the combos in the Fallen Kingdom, for instance, they've got some great things they can do, but I think it might be a little trickier for a beginner player to see and predict how to pull those off in advance.
I definitely see that. And also, I think they're used in the tutorial, so that might help give some people the edge in deciding to start off with the Phoenix Elves too.
And I love the tutorial matchup, and that was one of the original faction matchups, having the Phoenix Elves and the Tundra Orcs, because they're so just entirely opposite decks in terms of their stats, their game mechanics, and yet it's a very fun, even matchup.
Yeah, you got Phoenix Elves burn stuff to the ground and Grog smashes,
So you think that's one of their even matchups? What are some of their best matchups, do you think?
Well, I think the Vanguard, I think they're very good against the Vanguard. The Cloaks, those are probably their best two matchups.
The Cloaks?
The Cloaks. Interesting.
And also you said Skyspear Avians now you did well against, right?
Right, well, but, I don't know if that's just a statistical anomaly. I still feel very stressed out whenever I play the Skyspear Avians.
Maybe that's why you do well. You're on high alert.
Do you think the Cloaks is after the changes or just in general?
Maybe less so after the changes. Being able to pull units back, they're not able to get those double attacks in as often.
With the machinists, yeah.
With the machinists. And because you usually have so many units adjacent to one another or adjacent to walls and not spread out, that limits some of the opportunities to use Dagger's ability.
And maybe also out of shadows if you've got a few units adjacent to Maldaria most of the time.
Right. That combo, being able to do out of shadows, get an assassination attack on you somewhere, either with Dagger or with another unit, is extremely powerful part of their kit. And I think just the way that the Phoenix Elves like to position themselves, it makes it a little more difficult to pull that off.
It was an interesting matchup. It got played in the league a while back. I remember there's a lot of debate about it because going into it, everybody thought that the Cloaks were going to be heavily favored because of the abilities they have to get to summoners and get those assassination kills. Phoenix Elves won by a couple percent, I think. They won by a couple games. And that was way before the buffs and changes. So that might be favored Phoenix Elves. I don't know how heavily, but...
Well, and with Maldaria's buff, that's definitely one of the matchups that her changes helped most. Not being able to attack through those units adjacent to her really helps against the snipers.
So what are some of their tougher matchups these days, do you think?
Well, the Storm Goblins have to be their biggest nemesis.
And Sand Goblins are probably rough too, right? I remember when that one came up, it was tough.
Right. Yeah, anything that is able to do additional damage other than an attack, and anything that can kind of do splash damage past an enemy is just a real problem for them. I haven't played a lot against the Filth yet, but just looking at their toolkit, I can anticipate that being a really tough matchup for the Phoenix Elves as well.
Fire Drake versus Abomination. Could be fun.
I imagine they might be good against the Chosen Grove just because you can play keep away all day.
Sure.
It's like, oh, you have a tree that can't move? I'll hit you and then pull myself back.
Well, and they can do the same thing with their Stag Riders, so I don't know. It might be kind of interesting. I don't think I've gotten to play that one yet.
Yeah, it could be really curious back and forth. Probably goes as most Chosen Grove games go to the end.
Yep.
What are some common mistakes you see people making with the Phoenix Elves?
I think one of them might be leaving vulnerable units that you can't take advantage of when your opponent attacks them. You have, the archers, for instance, they're great at getting that automatic 1 damage before they attack. So you can weaken a unit a little bit and then try to get the kill with the attack. You can just do chip damage on things on the side. The problem is, with only 2 life, they're pretty easy to take out in return. And so if you're going to put them on the field, you want to make sure that you're getting an advantage out of it rather than just having a trade and burning through cards in your deck. And I think a lot of that has to do with positioning. If you're going to play a unit, make sure that it's not just going to get killed unless you're getting an advantage out of being able to have it on the field for that one turn. I think the other thing might be pulling out champions too early. I always like to have 3 magic at minimum, 5 ideally. And so bringing out a champ, unless you're pretty sure you're going to be able to get at least back to 3 magic on your turn, in some cases it can end up being a detriment to you because you just have less material and less bluffing ability for your counterattack on the next turn.
I think that's fair. I think too often you'll see players, especially newer players, try and summon a champ right when they get the magic for it, and then they don't have the magic to like sustain and protect that champ, and therefore the champ's not near as effective, not just in the Phoenix Elves, but with a lot of different factions.
Certainly, and I mean, so 3 magic is kind of my go-to minimum. I like having 5 magic, and again, it's with the Ember Beasts. So just being able to, or at least being able to threaten to summon one of your 1-cost Ember commons, either an archer or a mage, and then summon an Ember Beast or 2 off of that, just gives an awful lot of projection and ability to threaten a lot of spaces, even if your walls are pretty far back.
What do you think about... So this is one of the biggest, I think, conundrums about playing Phoenix Elves or playing against them. What do you think about the defensive turns with Phoenix Elves? Because they have a lot of them. Like, you could have a Blinding Flare turn where you don't really have any good options, or you could have a Divine Ret Spirit of the Phoenix turn that you're playing against, where you'll take 2 damage every time you attack something. So how do you feel when your opponent doesn't do anything and just like takes inactivity damage? Or like, what do you think are the best ways to work around those defensive turns that Phoenix Elves have?
Or you say like tips for what people playing against the Phoenix Elves might want to do when you play defensively, or what you as a Phoenix Elf might want to do when your opponent plays defensively?
More tips for like people playing against them, and like, what do you feel like accomplished if your opponent takes inactivity damage on one of those turns? Do you feel like that's not great? What are you looking for in your opponent's reaction on those defensive turns that you feel like it was effective?
He means like when you play like Spirit of the Phoenix and Divine Retribution together.
Sure. Yeah. Honestly, I think a lot of people might benefit from taking an activity damage on those turns, especially if they can't get a couple pings on your gates. Well, it depends a lot on the summon. I think a lot of people are just very hesitant to take that inactivity damage to your summoner. But in some ways, because you've taken a defensive move, you're in a nice spot. If the opponent doesn't take the bait, if they don't go up against your Divine Retribution, if they don't go forward, then you have to start pushing momentum the other direction and maybe put yourself in a little bit less advantageous of a position. So if my opponent sits back and takes that inactivity damage, that makes me a little worried. The other thing is always, go for the gates. I think the gates are one of the biggest weaknesses for the Phoenix Elves. If there isn't an attractive unit to attack, but you can get to a gate, I never think that's a wasted turn playing against them.
Yeah, we had Devlin Fish on for the Skyspear Avian episode, and he brought up a interesting tactic with the Avians that I had not thought of, in that he will use Sky Assaults against Phoenix Elves or Mountain Vargrath, especially, to just go straight for the gate, that 10 health gate, like if he has a good Sky Assault turn, like almost right out the bat.
Oh yeah, and I can tell you, against the Phoenix Elves, great tactic. I hate to see it.
You ever get the, what I like to consider the ultimate defensive play, in which you have Finessa out and you play Spirit of the Phoenix and have Divine Ret, and then they take that 4 damage when they attack Finessa up close?
I'll do that for now. In some ways, I think it's overkill.
Yeah.
What happens more often than not in that case is because I've already put Finessa out and I've used 2 good events. Either they don't attack her at all, or they'll attack her with a 1 health common where it's overkill at that point. And so they're probably getting more out of doing the chip damage, even if it destroys that last health, than I'm getting benefit from playing all those things at once on it.
That's fair.
We kind of skimmed over it before, but what cards do you usually end up discarding for Magic?
Yeah, so Guardians, more often than not, I'll drop. The Blinding Flare, that one, 90% of the time I'll drop that.
Do you play both your burns? I don't know if we talked a lot about burn.
Oh yeah, I guess we haven't talked about burn as much. That's very situational. That depends on the matchup. If it's a very melee heavy faction, I'll probably use both of those burns. If they tend to be more ranged, then because you only have that 2 space range from your summoner to get to play it, I'll probably drop them for Magic. I worry about making myself too vulnerable to get in range to really make them use, or maybe I'd have to keep them in my hand for so long for them to be useful that I would rather just have the Magic to summon something else. I think it's a good event. It just is very situational depending on the matchup. And that is one of the Phoenix Elves' tools for keeping people off your walls. I'm calling them walls again,
Yeah, I mean, it definitely does help, especially if it's a momentum play for sure. Like if you're pushing up or like have the momentum and you need to take out some units, or if you need to take some momentum back, do some defensive plays. Either way, burn can be very effective. But if Maldaria is not close to anything, it's tough to hold, I think.
One of the other more common times I'll think about using it is if there's a 4 or 5 life unit that Maldaria can attack. I would much rather burn and then only have to get 2 or 3 hits to get a kill rather than all 4 or not be able to get the kill at all, and then worry about other enemies with my other units on my attack.
Probably good against unit or factions that also have lower life units, like when you're getting swarmed by cave goblins or something like that.
And this is interesting. I know, Jexic, you're a big fan of the cave goblins. I don't really play in the tournaments or leagues online much. I'm mostly just doing the general matchmaking. You hardly see anyone play the cave goblins, which is disappointing. I think they're a really interesting faction. I would love to see more people play them just in regular ranked games.
Yeah, it's the Crimson Order's fault. It's just a bad matchup.
Yeah.
I think they were more common before. I think I've been playing them a lot now. Again, I think they're decent against these 2 new factions. So hopefully there's a new Cave Goblin resurgence, but we'll see.
The Crimson Order was one that, when they first came out, were giving me a lot of difficulty with the Phoenix Elves. Now I feel pretty confident against them, but I guess it took more adjustment from kind of my general Phoenix Elf strategy than most of the other decks out there.
But going back to what you've said a little bit earlier, I was actually thinking about the Crimson Order because Spirit of the Phoenix just wrecks those cultists. Like you play Spirit of the Phoenix and get some Ember Beasts or Archers out, and you can just kill like 6 units in a turn, and that feels great.
Absolutely.
You really got to be careful doing stuff like that on the online version, though, against Crimson Order, because I'm sure I'm not the only one who's done this, but I've accidentally killed like a devout cultist with a damage effect mid-turn, and then it rolled, and I couldn't go back, and I was like, I was still planning that turn. This is half-baked. This is not good. I think last time I did it was with the Forge.
I think for me, that's always the Shimmer Sea Fae and accidentally drawing and looking at a card when I wasn't sure that's what I wanted to do yet. No, that one always gets me.
Or Eternal Council, and you miscount, and you're not able to like Psychic Assault through something, and instead just have to attack it with Edia anyway when it's got 1 life.
It's got 1 life. You attack it with 8. You're like, yeah, those ways you can't go back that are a little less friendly than. Well, I don't know. Both you guys I think have played in in-person tournaments. Is it more like friendly? Are people like okay with? If it hasn't been rolled, like cards being taken back, or is it depend on the person?
Or is it like chess? You take your finger off the piece and it's there forever.
The in-person community, at least the Gen Con tournament's the main kind of organized tournament play I've done in 2nd edition. And the community, I think, is tight-knit enough that people are pretty easygoing, as long as you're not doing anything drastic or trying to do something after you've rolled an attack, people are usually fairly considerate and happy to let folks change things around.
Although I guess at their own peril, because if you have a 25-minute clock, you can't do too much of that.
True.
Well, yes, yeah. I guess in some ways, yeah, that's the cost of wanting to undo things or change things around. You're still just burning through that time. Yeah.
Do you find it a bit different? I know you do 45-minute games online too sometimes. Do you prefer the live play or these 3-day games that have become popular with the way the game works?
To me, a lot of it depends on the faction. There are some factions that I enjoy the real-time matches a lot. And yeah, I guess it does. It depends a lot who you're playing with, which I prefer more. So the Phoenix Elves, for instance, those I do a lot of 45-minute matches because I just feel like I know how I want to play them. I've just played so much with them that I look at the board, I kind of know what I want to do. A lot of the factions that maybe I don't play with quite as often, I want that extra time to kind of sit and think about it and not feel rushed. Especially with some of the ones that you're doing more on your turn. You got fungal dwarves and extra boost going all around the board. Those ones stress me out a little bit in real-time matches. And the Phoenix Elves don't necessarily have those kinds of mechanics, and so I like the flow of the real-time games a little better with them.
When I was doing a lot of 45-minute games, it was with the factions I knew well too, like Obsidian Dwarves and Tundra Orcs. The one thing that I remember, I was playing in one of the turtle tournaments, and it came up like I was playing High Elves versus Fungal Dwarves. It was one of the rare moments where
Oh
I just
no.
where I just like slept on that night. I like, I can't take this turn. I'm just gonna go to bed. I'll wait till tomorrow to figure this out, because it was just it was an end game situation. I was like, I don't know what the right play is. I'm sure there is a right play, but I can't see it right now.
Yeah, that's a brain burner. I don't play a ton of 45 minutes, but when I do, it tends to be factions that I want to just get super aggressive with. So like I played, I don't know if it was last season or the season before, but I played a little bit of Wayfarers 45 minutes. And I just went for face. I was like, I'm just gonna try and crank out a couple games, just gonna go as fast as possible.
More time, have you tried the live league out? I'm not sure I've seen you on there. I think
I've
you might.
not. I've liked the idea, and just timing wise, it's been going on when I've had other things I need to be doing.
There's other things you gotta do besides Summoner Wars? I thought.
I mean, it's fairly flexible in that you have like a month to schedule your 4 games, and then it wasn't too bad this last time. Like, our division got a bunch of them cracked out in like a week, and then we're waiting on the rest of everyone to finish.
Yeah, I'll definitely keep an eye out because I love the idea. I'd like to try it.
I mean, James is the king of getting games done fast. I don't know if anybody has gotten to that level of, you want to finish your games? They're going to be done. I don't know if I'll win them or not, but they'll be done.
Yeah, I bumped up to Division 1 in the league, and that's like the king of like people not finishing games quickly. So it'll be interesting to see what happens when I play in there, just how it'll go.
Yeah, that's the division that's always like starting on Monday, 14-day games.
I think for me, one thing with the 3-day games is I don't like leaving turns hanging over, and so for me, sometimes it gets to me a little bit if like I'm trying to get to sleep, and then I look at my phone, and it's like, shoot, someone moved. Now I've got to take a turn in this game. And so I like being able to just play through a game and get it done in the 45.
The only thing that's tricky sometimes with the 45-minute timers is like you don't get somebody right away, or you'll wait half an hour before the game starts, and then it's like, well, now I don't have my 45 minutes that I had, like...
Oh, yep, that is the risk. Yeah.
Yeah, I had one 45-minute game that I didn't realize started, and I ended up playing the entire game with like an 8-minute clock or something. It was insane. I won it too. I don't know how, but it was crazy.
I do think one nice thing is that there are a lot of folks out there, and I've been both on the giving and receiving end of this, where if you end up in one of those games and someone isn't moving for a while, people let me know on Discord, like, hey, we're in a match. I see you haven't moved in 15 minutes,
Another thing I was wondering, did you ever play against Taka on his rise with the Deepwood Groaks?
I think so, yeah.
Because the rumor was that he was just playing 45-minute games, and that's why he was like, it's like he was avoiding a lot of some of the players that are on the higher end of that ladder, but he must have been only winning pretty much with the Deepwood Grog. So we're curious what he was like to play.
Oh, well,
against.
I was definitely going on a losing streak against the Deepwood Grogs at that point. So that was another faction that I have no idea what my win percentage is against them, but it's always a very stressful matchup for the Phoenix Elves.
Yeah, well, they can do a lot of damage, and they've got the Seers that can just pick away at you even if you're far back. So I can see that being difficult.
The big thing with the Seers is also because you don't have to have that direct line of sight. Whoever you have in front of Maldaria, they can take out, enabling another unit to get an attack on you.
Mm-hmm.
That's just brutal.
Yeah, it is pretty rough. Do you think it's Storm Goblins or Deepwood Grogs are worse for Phoenix Elves?
Probably the Storm Goblins. Just because you're always having units next to Maldaria, it makes it so easy for them to just keep getting chip damage with Chain Lightning. There are a couple things, I try to do against them. That is one of the few matchups where I'm definitely playing most of my Guardians just to blanket on the name of the unit, their little one life.
The Volt Swappers?
Yeah, the Volt Swappers. So impede that movement, stop them from getting into position. I also, I've got to switch up my wall placement a lot against them. Normally, I like to kind of position my walls with the Phoenix Elves in kind of that L shape so that you can place units adjacent to one another in those windows, but I'll leave little gaps of just one space, so B3 for a starting wall instead of B2, just to limit the amount of ways there are around your formation to get to your summoner.
That makes sense, but it still seems tough.
Gen Con tournament last year, they were the new exciting faction at that point, and I was really worried that a lot of people were going to be running Storm Goblins. Mm-hmm. And so I still used the Phoenix Elves, but that was the one faction I ran that it was a bad match. Like, well, I've got to use the Phoenix Elves. They're my best faction. But I didn't run anyone else who was bad at the Storm Goblins. Last round, in the finals of the tournament, I ended up going up against Phasmonauts Storm Goblins, sure enough.
Yeah, that's tough. But to make it to the finals back-to-back years, right? I mean, that's pretty great.
I think people sleep on the Phoenix Elves. I think they're a great faction. They've got a lot of great tools,
And like you were saying, there may be an easier one to jump into because you don't need to know these elaborate combos so much.
For me, the Shadow Elves are definitely the faction where there's the biggest disparity in how strong they feel when I'm playing with them versus how strong they feel when I'm playing against them.
So what are some other factions you like when you go into a Gen Con, you need 4 or 5 factions? What are some of the other ones you take?
I like the Mountain Vargath a lot. They're all around, and again, I think they're also a very, straightforward faction. They have combos, but you can see them all just with what you're putting down on the board one step at a time. The Savannah Elves have always been, I'm not alone in liking them as a high-tier faction. After that, it's always a toss-up. I think I ran Crimson Order last time as another one.
A little tougher when you got the timer, though, right?
Right.
That game's going to go long one way or the other.
Didn't want to run any fungal dwarves? I mean, come on. That timer is nothing.
I was honestly thinking about it other than the Storm, because that's another one where, I was so worried about the Storm Goblins that tournament as, the new hot faction, and that's another one where they just chain lightning through your whole formation you got set up.
Yeah, it's brutal for the fungal dwarves, the Storm Goblin matchup.
It's like, how would you like to take 8 damage on your commons? What do you like best about heading to those Gen Con tournaments?
I mean, I guess at this point there's, one part of it is just a sense of a lot of nostalgia. I've been doing the Gen Con Summoner Wars tournament since 2011. That was a big part of going to my first Gen Con was, I want to enter the Summoner Wars tournament. And there's still some other folks, from the first edition community that still come back and play, so that's always kind of fun. We don't have a big Summoner Wars community yet in my current city anyway, so it's great to play some of the physical game at a competitive level. I get some of the same rewarding tension that I would get, thinking of going to chess tournaments in my childhood and things. And I've done some of the online tournaments. I don't know. It seems different playing in person. Getting to see your opponent's, reaction and you feeling stressed and them feeling stressed, but it's still being a tight-knit community where everyone has a good time playing. I like the environment.
I gotta make it out to Gen Con one of these years, maybe next year.
Maybe we show up together. The discard crew makes an appearance. I have never been to Gen Con, and I would like to make it at some point.
It's not too far for either of us, really.
No, like 7 hours for me now.
Oh, maybe it's a little more for you. It's like 4 hours for me, I think. 4 or 5, yeah.
Not terrible, though.
And people are like, wait a minute. They'll turn around and say, I didn't think you'd look like that. Or whatever. Unless they've been on... I guess they know what you look like, Aaron, because...
Everybody knows what I look like.
and people who knew first edition know what I used to look like.
Well, yeah, that is also kind of fun, seeing some of the folks you've played online in person. James, like, we've met in person at the Gen Con Summoner Wars type things, but it wasn't, I think, until after last year's tournament that you realized that I was Morningtime online Summoner Wars.
Yeah, because we hadn't interacted that much, and someone's just like, "Oh yeah, Morningtime won it." I was like, "Oh, that's so and so. I remember him from that Wake Forest crew." And it sounds like you're the only one who, out of those 4, who still play second edition.
I mean, the other folks play casually, or but not so much playing the public matches.
Yeah, I remember like me and Cody were the reason that everyone thought the cloaks were bad because we kept doing well with them in testing, and then
the old crew got together. We tried doing some of the 4-player Summoner Wars with second edition as well. I know there aren't officially supported rules for it, but it's still, it holds up pretty well. I think it's, pretty much works pretty much as well as it did in first edition.
I guess the big question is trying to because we tried to do it at our recent meetup too, and we were wondering like how to interpret friendly and like the way active events work and stuff like that. Does like Perplexing Tempest, for example, sticks around for a while, and makes everybody slow.
So strong,
like
then.
And then does Ramming Advance help your friendly team? That kind of thing, because it sticks around too. Does like when it gets your teammate's turn, does he also get Ramming Advance? Because it says friendly units. So is friendly just this summoner, or is it both? Because then you could get into some weird combos if you allow friendly to affect your teammate too. Although I don't think it'll ever be like an official thing. I think it's fun to mess around with it for sure in second edition too. That's something I'd like to try to do more.
The tough part always with the 2v2 version was if one person loses a partner, then it just goes downhill real fast.
Yeah.
Then they just get ganged up on.
I mean, the game's got to end sometime.
That's true. Well, Morningtime, do you have any last words of wisdom for our new Phoenix Elves aficionados?
I think that pretty much covers it.
Well, we appreciate you coming on the episode.
Oh yeah, thanks again for having me. This has been fun.
If people want to reach out to you for more advice, just reach out on the Discord, or...
Yeah, I'm on the Discord, Morningtime, just like I am in-game. Hope to see some of you folks out there.
Sounds good. This has been a Discard for Magic, and we'll see you guys in a couple weeks.